I guess the way I think about networking, community involvement, business development, things like that, is really in two senses at the highest level. Macro are things that help me to establish and maintain my brand in the community, being a known guy, being known by a lot of people, being thought of as quality. They may not know exactly 100% what I do. Hopefully they do, though. Examples for that would be, for me, in some senses, ProVisors. Getting to know you folks here today, or I've been the president of ACG for a number of years. That's another good example, sort of larger networking groups, or when I go to trade industry events in branded consumer products industry. It's really just being known. And that, I think, gives you a little bit of credibility when you're walking in, when you're dealing with, I'm an attorney, when I'm dealing with opposing counsel, it's like, yeah, he does deals, he's in the community, he's a good guy. So it gives other referral sources the chance to speak up for you. But that alone isn't enough. I also need to think about it from a micro standpoint, which is a little bit what David's talking about with respect to allies. And that's really establishing deep, deep relationships with allies and with clients, both for retention, also for cross-selling, and certainly for referral as well. I would say examples of those kind of activities include breakfast, lunches, ball games, sending a client a note, giving a call, attending life events. And for me, when I try to be systematic about my work, is I want to blend my month with both macro and micro. If I'm doing just macro, if I'm doing just micro, I'm not doing my job. So I need to be very deliberate in terms of making sure not only am I doing both, but I'm doing both in the percentages that fit both where I'm at personally in terms of my originations, but also what's going on in my industry. And so I'm trying to be very thoughtful each month, at the start of each month, what percent do I want to spend on macro and what percent do I want to spend on micro? I don't know about the rest of the folks in the room, but for me, I'm not just a pure finder. For me, I also deliberately work on my clients' matters, assist some of my partners. So I can't just be out finding all the time. And also it's important to me to be a good husband and a good dad and a good friend. And so realistically, there's only a limited amount of time. And so again, I try to be very deliberate in allocating micro and macro. So let's say in a given month, I'm going to spend, just for ease of math, 100 hours networking. And I decide that I want to do 50-50 between macro and micro. I then will even, I'll be very deliberate. Okay, I've got 50 boxes to fill for macro. I've got 50 boxes to fill for micro. And then I think about within that, how do I want to allocate that? So macro, I'm going to spend 30 hours on ProVisors and 20 hours on ACG. Okay, cool. I've filled those boxes. If something else comes up, pretty much unless it's absolutely extraordinary, one time only, I kick it to next month because I don't want it to infringe on the 50 micro boxes I've got. Within the micro boxes, I start to think about, okay, how many am I going to devote to resources? How am I going to devote to referral sources? How many to allies? And how many to clients? And try to be very deliberate about that and thoughtful in advance at the beginning of each month to try to set up those meetings. In fact, I try to set them up at least 30 days in advance to make sure I'm really doing it. It helps me to stay on point to see, am I doing what I said I was going to do? So it helps me to be accountable to myself. But also it helps me deal with those opportunities that inevitably come up that could throw me off course for what's my plan. Because for me, I've got to be the one that sets the agenda. I can't let whoever's calling me or asking me to breakfast or a given conference set the agenda for me. I've got to be the one that sets the agenda for it. And so once those boxes for the month are filled, they're filled. And I move on to next month. I think of it as tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. The easiest example I can give would be with a client. So for example, a tier 1 client is a regular user of a substantial amount of my services. Tier 2 would be regular user of a small amount of services, and tier 3 would be an occasional user of a small amount of services. I mean, the same thing would translate to allies, same thing would translate to referral sources, same sort of thing. But I try to, not all are created equal, so I try to categorize each one into tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and then figure out how often I want to touch folks within that category. For instance, a tier 1, I may want to talk to on the phone once a month and be together in person once a quarter. Tier 2, maybe talking on the phone once a quarter and being together once a year is sufficient. But I try to think about at what point does it become diminishing marginal returns, and how much time do I want to invest into the relationship? And for me, having tiers is helpful. So, and then also once I figure out how many touches I want to have, okay, so, Nancy's a tier 1, and so I'm going to try to get together with her once a quarter in person and once a month by phone. I will be deliberate in terms of my target. And again, sort of like I was talking about earlier, I have a certain number of boxes per month, same sort of thing. I have a certain number of touches. That's my goal with Nancy, and this helps me to stay on track. Am I doing it or not? And once I've done it, I can say, okay, cool. I invested enough into this relationship for what I think is appropriate. Then I can spend the rest of my time on my other allies or my other clients or however else I've allocated my month. Because again, there's a finite amount of time, and if I'm, just like you don't want to underspend time like David was mentioning, you also don't want to overspend time either. The trick is finding that right amount of time, and for me also making sure I do it, because we all get busy with client work or family or life or whatever. For me, this helps me to have a manageable building blocks, and also it's a little bit of emotional reinforcement. It sort of feels good to check off the box. Okay, cool. I set a plan. Here was my objective. I accomplished my objective, and it gives me little attaboys as I'm going through my day, my week, my month, and so that's been real helpful. For me, the other thing I've had to do is rely on my assistant as well, make her part of my team. And so she will help me with this process. She will help me to set up meetings. It's not something that I can do all on my own because I'm spending a whole bunch of time setting up the meeting. That's additional hours eaten away from me actually being at the meeting or on the call. The other thing is I have a long commute. I live in Sherman Oaks and I work in Century City, and so I'm in my car a lot. And so those, to me, rather than just being idle hours or being frustrated with traffic, I've completely changed, and my assistant gives me a call sheet every day before I leave work and says, okay, according to your plan, you want to talk to these tier 1 people or these tier 2 people this month. Here's your list of 10 that you haven't yet spoken to. And so as I'm driving home, I try to make sure that I hit those 10 or as many as I can, report back to her in the morning, and then the next day's call sheet, we'll have the next group. So she helps me to stay on track. And I try to make use of whatever time I have because, to me, time is my most precious commodity.